Hello, and thanks for tuning in. The time has come to cover the awesome 2D tracking built into HitFilm Ultimate. 2D tracking is used to find a specific feature in a video and keep track of how that feature moves about within the frame. I used 2D tracking here to control all the effects in this scene so that they move in harmony with the prop that I'm holding. My name is Axel Wilkinson, and in this tutorial I will work through the entire tracking process to show you how to use it too. The first step to tracking your footage is to create a new tracker by clicking the pushpin icon either on the timeline or in the controls panel. This creates a new tracker on the timeline, opens up the track panel so we can adjust the options that we use, and switches the viewer to the layer panel so we can work with our specific layer to create the track. Setting up our tracker involves two steps: choosing a feature to be tracked on our layer and selecting the options that we want the tracker to use in the track panel. The type menu allows us to choose whether we will create a single point track or a double point track. If you are simply tracking the position of a feature, like the end of this antenna, which is what we're going to start with, then a single point track is the simplest and fastest way to handle that. Later in this tutorial, we will use double point tracking to position the screen elements onto the prop. But first, let's perform a basic single point track straight through to place the blinking light on the antenna. We'll keep the method on optical flow, which gives superior results in most cases. So now we need to select a feature and set up the elements of our tracker in the layer panel. I prefer to start at either the first or last frame of the clip in which the feature I'm tracking appears. In this case, the feature is out of frame at the start of the clip, so I'm going to move to the last frame and then track backwards from there. Let's zoom in a bit. I'm using the scroll wheel to do that. You could also use the zoom menu. And then we'll use the hand icon to reposition our view so that we can see our feature and the tracking elements that we need to place on it. And then with the selection tool, just grab inside the red box and drag those tracking elements to the feature that we want to track. There are three elements to each tracking point. The green outer box is the search area, the inner red box is the feature area, and then this point in the center is the feature offset. The red inner box, the feature area, defines the feature to be tracked. And so as HitFilm works through this footage one frame at a time, it's going to search each frame to try find the contents of this red box after we set it up. You can click inside the box to drag it to a new location, and then grab any one of the corners and drag to adjust its size and shape. The feature which we select to track can have a big impact on how well the tracking works. Try to find a small feature with a clear shape and decent contrast. Vague details or low contrast areas will be much more difficult for HitFilm to keep track of as it works through the footage. The feature we've selected here, this bright silver ball surrounded by green, should be fairly easy to track. Adjust the feature area so it is just a bit larger than the feature that you're tracking. For this antenna ball, if we made the feature area too large, then a bunch of grass would be included in our feature as well, and that would cause some confusion to HitFilm as it tried to track both the grass and the antenna. So, we'll readjust the size of that box until it's just bigger than the ball that we're tracking. The green outer box is the search area and tells HitFilm where to search in each frame to find the feature that we've selected. So HitFilm is going to search through the entire area contained in this green box to try find a match for the contents of the red box. If the green box is too small, then our feature might move too quickly and end up outside the search area, and the track would be lost. If we were to make the green box huge, then tracking is going to take much longer because there's more area that needs to be searched, and there's a greater chance of the tracker jumping to the wrong place and accidentally finding another feature that looks similar to the one we selected. So, we need to find a balance between making sure the green box is big enough to contain the movement of our feature, but small enough to keep the tracking fast and accurate. The third element, this dot in the center, is the feature offset. This allows us to reposition the point we want to apply the tracking to. As HitFilm goes through our footage tracking the contents of the red box, it will record the exact position of the feature offset for each frame, and this is the information that will be used when you apply the track. So moving the feature offset can be very useful when the location in the frame to which you want to apply an effect has no features to track. You could track a clear feature elsewhere in the frame and then adjust the feature offset to the position where you want to add the effect. For this particular track, we'll go ahead and just move that back to the center. And now that we have our tracker set up, we can start the actual tracking process. Click the Track Forward or Track Back button to start automatically tracking the feature through your footage. Now, I happen to know that this particular track is going to eventually stop, so as much fun as it is to watch HitFilm doing its thing, I am now going to edit out a bit of the tracking process and jump ahead to where the stop occurs. Oh dear, the track has stopped, whatever shall we do? Well, first, we need to determine why it stopped so that we can correct the problem. It's a bit tricky here to see what's happening with our feature because it's obscured by our tracking path. So let's open the viewer options and turn the tracking path off. Now we can move between the frames on the timeline using the comma and period keys to try see if we can identify the problem. Okay, so notice how the feature is blurred a bit on this frame, but the optical flow tracking in HitFilm has still been able to recognize this as the feature it's trying to track despite the blur. But as we move on to the next frame, notice that the feature has moved outside of the search area. It's moving too fast, and so it ended up outside that green box, so HitFilm can't find it in the search area. So let's step back a frame to where the track is still good and expand that search area, and then we can use the Track Back by one frame button to step to the next frame and see how the track holds. Well, here HitFilm was still unable to track that feature, probably because of the amount of blur involved. So what we can do is just grab the feature area, I'll zoom in a bit, and we'll just drag that and manually reposition it back into the center of our feature. And then after that, we can step to the next frame and see now the track was able to hold. And so we can just, in this case, manually reposition it on those few frames that are necessary to work through until we get to the end of the area that requires tracking. Once we've tracked enough frames, the next step is to apply the tracking information we've just created. There are two purposes we can put the tracking info to: stabilizing the layer we've just tracked, or using it to transform another layer and control its movement. First, let's choose Stabilize to see what that does. You notice we have options to apply the X position or Y position, or both. We can toggle them on and off to select. And then let's click Apply and see what happens. At first we can't see anything because we're still in the layer panel, but if we switch to the viewer, then we can see that now that layer has moved over to the side somewhat, so that the point that we tracked at the end of that antenna is now exactly in the center of the frame. As we hit play, the feature we tracked stays in the exact same location, and the rest of the footage moves around to keep it stable. If you use this technique on a fixed background element in the scene, such as a detail on a building, it can be used to eliminate unwanted camera movement. In this case, though, that's not what we want to use our tracking data for, so let's hit Ctrl-Z to undo that so we can go back and use the Transform option. So back in the track panel, let's change the purpose to Transform, and now we need to select a layer to apply our tracking data to. Now we could use the blinking light layer, which contains the effect we're eventually going to apply, but in most cases I find it more effective to use a point layer. Now you can apply the tracking data to any layer you want, but in most cases using a point will give you more flexibility later on. So let's create a new point layer. We'll go ahead and rename that to something logical like Antenna Track. And now we can select our tracker and assign that new point as the layer to apply our track to. Click Apply, and now when we go back to the viewer, you can see if we select that point, it's locked right onto the end of our antenna, and as we play the footage, it stays permanently attached to that spot. So now all we have left to do is to attach the blinking light. Now I've already got that effect created in this project, so I'll activate that layer, and as I scrub through you can see right now it's just blinking up here toward the top of the frame a bit. If we select that layer, you can see that the effect is created just using a light flare and a flicker effect to make it blink. So in the light flare controls, if we open those up, we can open the hotspot position, and we'll just use the use layer command to select the antenna track, which is that point we just created. Now if we zero out the center values, we have that blinking light tracked perfectly onto the antenna exactly where we want it. And that is the basics of HitFilm tracking. That wasn't too difficult, right? Well then, if you're up for it, let's move on to double point tracking to add the screen effects to our prop. Let's go ahead and rename our tracker that we've already created to antenna so that we can distinguish between them. And then we can add a second tracker and we'll rename this one to screen. Now for this tracker, we will set the type to double points. And then I'm going to reposition the viewer here so we can see the prop better. And we will position these 2 points at opposite corners of our prop. When we're using 2-point tracking, HitFilm can measure the angle between the 2 points to calculate the rotation of the layer, and it can measure the distance between them to calculate any changes in scale. Therefore, keeping the 2 points as far apart as possible on the object will give the most accurate calculations. The rivets on the front of this case offer us some nice clear points to track, but we need to make sure that we select rivets that aren't obscured by my hands as they move around the frame. So it's best to scrub through a little bit just to make sure that you select points that are going to provide the clearest track, that don't get blocked or obscured by anything else in the frame. We're actually fine here because we only need to track the latter portion of the clip for this shot, and my hands are already out of the way by that point. So on this bottom row, I'm going to choose the second rivet just to make sure the search area doesn't include any of my hand out past the edge of the phone. And then on the top, I'll grab the last rivet in this row. Now, because we have so many similar rivets on the front of this case, it'd be very easy for HitFilm to accidentally grab the wrong one if we make the search area too big. And so we want to make the feature area very small, so it's selecting just one single rivet, and then keep the search area big enough that it's going to hold the movement, but not too big, otherwise all these other rivets are likely to confuse it, and it can't be sure which one to grab. So keep that as small as you can, while still making room to track the movement, and then we'll adjust this first feature the same way. Incidentally, when using double point tracking, you can see each of the 2 points listed on the timeline, and the feature offset for tracking point 1 is the information that's recorded by the track. In the method menu, let's choose template match this time. Template match looks for an exact pixel match to our selected feature. If the footage is nice and sharp, this can be more accurate. In most cases, optical flow is likely to be the best option and is the default method, but let's try template match here to track the fine details on this prop. The options menu gives you some further controls which can be fine-tuned. Until you're an expert, it's generally best to leave the options where they are when you start a track, and then adjust them as necessary if the track proves problematic. Error tolerance controls the precision of the tracking. If the tolerance is exceeded on any frame during tracking, then the tracking process will stop, like we saw with our track earlier. Iterations sets the number of times the optical flow algorithm refines the results of the track to ensure accuracy. The key here is to find a good balance between speed and accuracy. The default value of 15 is usually a good starting point. If you're using the template match method, then you can choose whether it examines the luminance or RGB channels to find a match. The luminance option is more versatile, but if the footage contains clear colors with low contrast, then RGB can give excellent results. The comparison method menu gives a variety of options which are hugely technical and confusing. Each one provides different results, and for any given piece of footage, one might work better than another, but it's difficult to predict which one will work best in a given situation. But if you're using template match tracking and it's being disobedient, you might try switching the comparison method. If you're using optical flow, this menu doesn't apply. So let's go ahead and leave all these options at their default settings, and now we are ready to begin our tracking. So let's click the track forward button, and HitFilm will start doing its thing. Let's go ahead and hit stop for a second. I want to go back into the options and turn show motion paths back on just so we can see them. And then we'll resume the tracking on this footage. So now the next step is to apply our tracking data once again. Let's create a new point and we'll rename it to something cunning like screen track, something easy to identify. And then we can select our screen tracker again and choose that point we just created as the layer to apply the track to. Now, because we used double point tracking, we now have the option to add rotation and scale data as well. So let's enable those options and click apply. Now back in our viewer, we have our 2D point, which is locked right to our prop. And our tracking doesn't actually start until right up here. But once we get to that point, then we can see our 2D point tracks nicely to the prop, and now we can parent our screen to that point. But we need the screen to be able to match the phone case in 3 dimensions. So let's go ahead and convert the screen layer to 3D. I've already got that layer added to the project, as you can see. So we'll change that to 3D plane. We'll add a camera. And now let's find the first frame of our tracking and adjust the transform properties of this layer until it aligns with our prop. Now this is going to involve adjusting the orientation of the X, Y, and Z axes. We'll have to adjust the position in all 3 directions probably, and reduce the scale of our layer so that it matches the screen of the prop that I'm holding. So just continue tweaking those settings until you get an alignment you're happy with. Okay, once we have our alignment good, then we can select our screen layer and parent it to the screen track point. And now, as we play through the footage, you'll see that the screen stays in basically the right position, but it's not really turning and rotating in the same way as the actual prop is in the scene. And that's because the prop is moving in 3 dimensions, whereas the tracking we've just done is only 2D tracking. To compensate for this, we'll need to add a few keyframes to the orientation of our screen layer. Now this would be much more difficult if we'd applied the tracking data directly to our screen layer. But because we used a point, we can easily adjust any parented layers as necessary to shift their position relative to the tracked point. So we can just work our way through the footage like this, just adding keyframes where necessary to correct the alignment and get it as close as we can to matching the prop in the scene. Now, of course, the only reason that this is necessary at all is because we're kind of cheating here in that we're using the 2D tracking in HitFilm to try and place a 3D object into our scene. A 3D tracking program might be better suited for this particular project, but even using the 2D tracking that's included in HitFilm, we can still get good results with a little bit of adjustment. So hopefully this gives you a clear idea of how to use the tracking included in HitFilm. Thanks for watching, and if you're interested in more details regarding exactly how I created the final effects, I invite you over to the sequel to this tutorial where I will pick up from here and get into creating the final effects that were used in this shot. So subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. If you'd like to, follow the link over to the sequel, and thanks again for watching.